Welcome to the 2021 to 23 Grant Management Training Series, Module 11 on Specialty Reporting. This training series was originally held in August and September of 2021. For the most recent guidance and information, please visit ODOT's Public Transportation Division website. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to your regional transit coordinator. They are always your number one resource. Inquiries captured during the live webinars have been compiled into a comprehensive question and answer document, which can be found on the training website.
Hi, this is Carol Cottingham. I'm ODOT's Intermodal Civil Rights Program Manager. In this module, I'm going to talk about specialty reporting for civil rights programs. Our civil rights programs include a variety of laws, rules, and regulations that are in place to ensure equitable access to public transportation. That includes our services, vehicles, and facilities, as well as public contracting opportunities. The specifics of these laws include Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Federal Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, among others. For the purpose of this training, I'm just going to talk about these in a high level without getting to the specifics of each rule. These programs are required for all entities that are receiving FTA funds through ODOT, and ODOT serves in a role where we have oversight, but what that really means is we provide technical assistance. It's our interest in having everyone comply with these programs, and by our subrecipients being in compliance, that's how we are in compliance with the FTA. So the general programs that we're going to cover today all have some reporting requirement, although it is not necessarily something that is a regular or routine requirement. These include Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and public participation requirements, the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program and the use of certified firm, as well as equitable access, including for persons with disabilities. So the schedule for these, for anyone who's been receiving money from ODOT over time, is that every 3 years, you need to update your Title VI program plan. Annually, you need to report any Title VI program changes that are major. You need to report your complaints, lawsuits, and then any major service changes, including fare changes, major route changes, etc., that are permanent. Short-term or temporary changes do not need to be reported. And semi-annually, you need to do what's called a DBE utilization report, which is a reporting on FTA funds that have been received and then been used for contracting purposes. For doing a Title VI program plan, ODOT has a variety of resources, as does FTA. For most of our subrecipients, you already have a Title VI plan in place on file with ODOT, as well as it's typically available on your website and in your own files. So when it comes to reporting and updating, it's usually just updating a plan, not writing something from scratch. The common needs that we have when we're updating our Title VI program is a description of services, so reviewing everything that was in the plan from 2, 3, 4 years ago, making sure that it still matches what your agency does. LEP, which is limited English proficiency, data and analysis, so updating demographic information about persons that use or may use your services. Public participation plan, so reporting on both public participation activities that you conduct, as well as your plan and your approach for public participation, especially around decisions that would affect your services. And then finally, the posting, both of forms and website, posting in buses, offices, things like that. And when we go through this process, you'll be notified either through Office of Civil Rights or through your RTC. And this update, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are serving as a technical resource, and we're really looking for helping you get that plan updated. And Office of Civil Rights will provide review, assistance. We can provide examples when we have them. and ultimately we'll accept it as complete. But the final step will be the subrecipient agency, which is transit provider or other entity, approving your own plan. Other specialty reporting that comes up on a semi-annual basis is for the DBE program. The DBE program is something that's required for all US DOT assisted contracts. So everything under the umbrella of federally funded transportation programs, including FTA and transit. And the program is called Disadvantaged Business Enterprise because that's what's in the original federal law. But the purpose of the program is not just for these DBEs. It's intended to expand the opportunity for all businesses to know about how to bid, where to bid, and have the opportunity to bid on public contracts. In the state of Oregon, we also have many state certifications, including women-owned business, emerging small business, service-disabled veteran businesses, and others. And we're just as interested in expanding opportunities to all of those businesses. Our statewide target for transit funding to be spent is 4.25% of all of our publicly let money. And we achieve that from ODOT, we achieve that through the help and work with all of our transit providers. This is because most of the Federal Transit Administration money that we receive is distributed throughout the state. We don't let a lot of the contracts directly from ODOT. So for this report, subrecipients will report on FTA funds that are received from ODOT. If you only receive funding from ODOT, then your report will reflect all of that. Direct subrecipients also need to report their FTA funds to FTA from FTA. This part can be sometimes confusing. Again, I'm always a resource when we are soliciting these reports, but if you received FTA funds from FTA, you report those to FTA. If you receive them from ODOT, you report them to us. And then ODOT, again, is aggregating and reporting a comprehensive report to FTA. There are some exceptions on what funding you report or not out of your federal funding. One of the biggest expenditures that we do not include in this program because it's covered elsewhere is vehicle purchases. When the request for semi-annual reports is sent out, we'll include instructions on what funds to use or not. And again, RTCs and Office of Civil Rights can be a resource for you. And finally, there's many other things that are considered within the civil rights programs. I've listed these here. These are things that do not necessarily have a routine reporting requirement, but they will interplay with other work that we all do. So ADA is a key piece to public transportation, and the most important thing is that it's about equitable access to our programs, services, and facilities. Again, there isn't a specific reporting requirement to ODOT, although there may be requirements that you have to other entities. And environmental justice. Environmental justice is a consideration of impact, especially things that, using the formal language here, potential disparate impacts or negative impacts on disadvantaged communities. The exact interpretation and needs and use applications of environmental justice or EJ can depend on the scope of a project or requirement. But again, there's no routine report or thing to submit to ODOT for these programs. Also, as mentioned below, all of these can be something part of a discrimination complaint, either with your agency or with ODOT about your agency. And there also may be requirements or pieces that come out of ADA or EJ work that are a piece of some other submittal or report that you have. And with that, I will hand it over to Sharon Perenboom.
So we're going to get started with specialty reporting topics, which will be charter bus, national transit database. There's the drug and alcohol management information system, and then there are some miscellaneous reports. And so the intent of this presentation is to let you know about the kind of reports you're going to need to do for 5311. And when we get to charter, it's going to go past the actual report because you need to know some things like what charter is if you're going to report it. Hi, this is Sharon Perenboom, and I'm going to go over the specialty type reports that are primarily for 5311, but there are a couple of places where 5310 might be involved a little bit. You're here to learn how to manage your grants. Also, the NTD part goes into a little more depth because the reporting takes up a lot of time every year and it's not going to go away. So charter bus reports. Under this, the topics are going to be background definitions, exemptions and exceptions, reporting, regulations and resources, and then practical matters. And so that we're going to talk about each of these kind of different aspects of it. Having the regulations makes sense because if you're a tax-paying private operator, you don't want to lose business to someone who's able to use federal assets to undercut your bids. You wouldn't want that if you were one either. And FTA is not in the charter business, and it wants to protect these private operators from the unfair competition. The charter regulations have actually been around for quite a while, and they were updated in 2008. And the primary reasons, or one of the outcomes, was it made things a little bit easier for the rural operators. So it's actually to your advantage. You may still actually hear them called the new charter rules, even though it was 2008. So nationwide, the biggest and the most complex issues have been in the urban areas where there are often lots of charter operators available, but there have also been some situations where it's come up in rural areas. So this is going to highlight some of the key points about charter service, and the complete charter regulations are available at 49 CFR .604, and we'll give you a link for that. You don't need to remember it. These regulations are what I call deceptively simple, and the question and answer section of the regulation is actually longer than the regulations themselves, and many opinions have been issued since 2008, so there have been tons of questions. If you're considering doing charter service or what you think might even be charter service after this presentation, please look at the charter regulations. As usual, your RTC is going to be your first point of contact for questions, and there are lots of situations and variations of them. And sometimes we've had questions that we have to actually send to the FTA charter office, to the ombudsman. So the definition of charter service, you can see it on your screen, is it's service that's requested by a third party for exclusive use of a vehicle and it's for a negotiated price. Or it can be service at public events that happen on an irregular basis or limited duration, and you charge a premium fare that's greater than the usual fixed route fare, or it's paid for by a third party. Charter service does not include demand response service. So if it's your normal day-to-day demand response service, you're fine. And with free service, that means it's definition by not charter. It still costs money to operate, so you will need to be careful about your funding source, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Exemptions and exceptions, which are sometimes confused. So there are 6 exemptions, and they're listed here, which are moving transit employees for transit purposes, or when you are a private charter operator, you might get FTA money, but you also have a part of your business that does not receive FTA funding. Emergency preparedness, planning and operations, which we know can happen, and responding to immediate emergencies. You can also transport employees for training purposes, and oh gee, Jamie, I just read it right. I've got to start all over again on this one. Okay. So now we're going to talk about charter exemptions. In these cases, the regulations do not apply, and you do not report anything that you do under this. There are 6 of them, and they include moving the transit employees for transit purposes, or private charter operators when they're performing service that does not receive federal money. So it could be that you do get money from FTA for some services, but you have a separate part of your business where you don't get any FTA funding, and that part is not subject to the charter regulations. It also does not cover emergency preparedness, planning, and operations, or responding to immediate emergencies, which we all know very well can happen. It does not involve transporting employees for training purposes or charter service that supports program purposes only for 5310 and 5311. So you're probably asking, just what are these program purposes? They serve the needs of either a human service agency or targeted population, elderly, individuals with disabilities, low-income individuals. That does not include exclusive service for other groups that aren't related to the needs of the targeted populations listed above. So an example of something that is not program purposes would be if a person or family charters a vehicle to take his relatives, including elderly aunts and a cousin who's a disabled veteran, to a family reunion. That's not related to the needs of these targeted populations. And there's even a question about this in the regulations. In fact, it's the second question in the Q&A section. Then we move on to the exceptions, and the charter regulations do apply to these. And if you do any of these services, they are included in the monthly report. There's 6 of them too. They're for government officials, qualified human service organizations, no registered provider responds to a notice, leasing, an agreement with all the registered charter providers, or petitions to the administrator. The most common one I've seen for this is probably transporting the government officials, because that can apply. And again, if you want to do this, you really should look up the details. Petitions to the administrator are pretty rare in rural areas. I've only seen one. It was granted. So again, if you're thinking about doing anything under one of these exceptions, you really should read the regulations first for the details. The presentation would just be way too long to include everything you need to know. So just be aware they're there. And if you have questions, contact your RTC first. So who does charter reporting? Probably you, if you're watching this. You have to report every charter service that you perform under an exception each quarter, which we covered what the exceptions are. We use the information supplied by subrecipients, which would be you, and the deadline is mid-month. The subrecipients, who are also 5307 recipients, do their own charter reports directly to FTA, and they don't report through ODOT, which is really common if you're a direct recipient that you don't report through us. And we're going to update the list of contact people with agencies the month prior to reporting. And if we get something wrong, just please let your RTC know so we can take care of that. Next is how the charter reporting is done. At the beginning of each quarter, you're going to report charter services that you performed under an exception for the previous quarter. For example, in July, you reported your charter services that were April through June 30th, that just ended. We're going to update our contact list the month before. As I mentioned, it's so hard to keep contact that we do want you to keep letting us know if it needs to be updated. Some people who've been doing charter reporting for years automatically do their report at the beginning of the quarter without being reminded, but we do send reminders because it can be easy to forget these things. Also, along with how to do it, there is a charter report form that's online. It's pretty easy to do. There are instructions available right there if you need them, but most of you, if you've been doing this, probably already know the drill. Most people respond no, they haven't done any charter service. And once you've done that, you're done for the quarter. If you know that you haven't done any charter service, the best thing really to do is just check the note and get it off your desk, because that way you won't get a reminder from us later. If you provided charter service, you'll be prompted for additional information on that online form, and it's one of those things where it kind of expands for you. And then we review all of the yes responses for charter service. And if there are any questions or information is missing, we'll contact you, talk to you about that. And actually, I will be the one contacting you. So that is probably a good incentive to get it right. So these are some links to charter bus regulations and other resources. Whether you intend to do charter services or not, I would suggest that you take a look at the regulations, like I've mentioned before, because you need to know what's charter and what isn't charter so that you don't find out one day that you're actually doing charter service without knowing it. And you need to know because you're held to them regardless of whether you know them or not. So these regulations are written in the bureaucratic style that we all hate, but they aren't super long. Just try to get the main points and don't spend a lot of time struggling with them. You really just need to know what's covered so that you can know where to go if you have questions later. For example, you can do charter service under an exception if no charter providers responds when you send a notice about the proposed service. There are a whole bunch of things that you need to do in a specific sequence. And it's probably never going to happen, but if it does, you'll know how to act quickly and go back and read about what you need to do. And don't forget that we're here to help you. So here, practical matters, that this is a little bit of going off script, but I think that you kind of want to learn how to manage your grants, like I mentioned earlier. And we can quote FTA stuff to you all day, and it's important, of course, that you're here to learn about management and you want to do things right and be compliant. So I guess I need to cover myself with disclaimer. As the title suggests, I just like to talk about day-to-day stuff, and regulations don't talk about day-to-day stuff. And as the slide says, FTA is clear that any charter service has to be incidental. You're not in the charter business, so it can't interfere with how long your assets last or decrease them. And we go on to even more practical matters. First, you don't have to do the charter service. In fact, most agencies just say no to charter. It's extra work and it can be a slippery slope. And as I mentioned earlier, you're not a charter company. It's great if there are local charter providers or even one, and you can refer people to the company, but that doesn't often happen in rural areas. So there've been some times when transit agencies have seen a need in their community and they wanted to help and pursue charter. So these are just some of the things you're going to want to examine to make your decision if you don't have a just say no policy. So there are even more practical matters. Charter service is going to require additional work, and do you want to take on that work? You have to work out the details with the customer and the specific trips and who's going to do the work, and you have to set the price. And working with customers isn't always easy. Now, if you have profit from the charter, it can be used as match for your grants. And since it's profit, but you don't do a whole lot of charter because you're not a charter company, it really might not be a lot anyway. So don't depend on that. And there are still more practical matters. I mentioned the thing about sending notices to registered providers earlier. That's where you send out notices to every provider who's registered to provide service in your area and then wait to see if any of them objects. And the list is anyone who claims to offer service in your area. No one, right? In some of these areas. Well, for example, there are 104 companies registered who say they will serve John Day. They don't really, of course, but you have to send a notice to all of them following some specific steps. And the sending part is actually reasonably easy, but when you get down to tracking responses and that kind of thing, maybe not so much. If a single company says they'll do it, you can't do the service. Maybe they charge too much, so the service just doesn't happen. Is it likely? Probably not. Is it possible? Yes. And then the final bullet talks about the possibility of dealing with a complaint if you don't follow the regulations, and that's true. I've never seen it happen, but it could, so I'm mentioning it. The thing is, a registered charter provider could file a complaint if it looks like you're doing charter, even if you're not really. And it's not likely to happen, and I've only dealt with one complaint from a charter operator, and it ended up with FTA. So it sounds like I'm trying to scare you out of charter, which I'm not. It's your decision, but it's important to remember that appearance account matters because transparency is important, so people don't think you're doing something you're not really doing. And even though a complaint is unlikely, just be mindful so you can avoid that. This is the last slide on the practical matters. So assuming that you want to do a charter and it's okay under the regulations, you found a way, which is, you probably can, how are you get funded? Charter service revenue needs to cover the fully allocated costs of the service. So what happens if the organization or person can't pay the fully allocated costs and you still want to do it? How do you pay for it? You can't use funds like 5311. So what do you have that's eligible to use? You can't give a discount that dips into any funds that aren't eligible. As I mentioned earlier, if you do this service for free, it's not charter, but you still need to find a way to pay for it. What if you don't have quite enough to do it for free and the organization wants to chip in and make up the difference? Well, then it's not free. Someone else chipping in, not free. It's that single dollar kind of thing that we mentioned a lot. A single dollar makes it subject to regulations. And then in a few rare circumstances, there have been different things that have happened that we've had to ask for interpretation for the charter ombudsman. Things have come up that they just didn't think about when they wrote the rules. So if that happens, we'll contact them. Odds are it won't happen, but there are exceptions to every rule. You also might want to think about precedent. If you do it for one person, are you going to have to do it for other people? And are you going to make anybody mad if you do it for one person and not for them? So it's just something to think about, and it's up to you what you want to do. It really is. So National Transit Database Reporting, which we call NTD, as probably everyone knows, and it's everyone's favorite. So we're going to cover the background, the uses, who reports, and the reporting phases. And it's going to be fairly high level because this is not a class on how to actually do the reporting. There's obviously not time for that. And different agencies have some different requirements. From an ODOT, PTD perspective, and I kind of use those terms interchangeably, we're primarily involved in the rural reporting, and that's what this is going to be about. So Congress decided in 1974 to start doing it, and the slides kind of, the bullets kind of talk about this without a lot of further explanation, but when they added the rural service, there really wasn't a whole lot to do. It was pretty simple, even though the rural reporters really thought it was, but it was one more thing to do, and the reporting procedures then were kind of clunky in terms of how we did it. So if you think it's hard to do the actual reporting part now, it's actually a breeze compared to how it used to be entered and edited. So it's really better, if that helps. And I totally get that it's a headache. Just try to remember that. And also, if you take a look at what the full reporters do, like the 5307s, TriMet, Salem, LTD, if you knew what they had to do, you would really feel a lot better, I think. I don't know if it'll help, but. So the uses of these data, you spend all this time doing this. And actually money talks, so that's why people care about NTD, probably the most of all. I can't list all the things that the NTD data are used for, or the people who use the data. The NTD data are available to the public, so there's really no way to know. A lot of students use the NTD data for their thesis or other projects, as well as other people. And you probably care the most about the top three, and that is, like I said, money talks. It helps to determine for both the rural and the urbanized the apportionment from the federal government to the states, which is different from the allocation that we have for 5311. This is the total amount that comes to the state. And then it'll support local planning and their annual reports to Congress. And so sometimes they use these things to also decide whether they want to support transit or not, which we clearly want them to. So who reports? One of the keys here is it's FTA direct recipients. People get money from FTA, as I mentioned before. So that includes the 5307 Urbanized Area Formula Program, who gets it directly from FTA. When it comes to the 5311, PTD is the direct recipient of the 5311 and some other programs. So that means that we at PTD have the responsibility for the NTD reporting. Because we aren't providing these services, we have to get this information from you. So we're on the hook, but that means we put you on the hook. So the full reporters, we really aren't involved with that at PTD, so there's not much to say. And it's pretty self-explanatory. The full reporters have to have a lot of data, and it's a little bit more if you're a bigger area than a smaller one. And if you're already a 5307, you know about this. Actually, some 5307 agencies, they have people actually dedicated to NTD reporting. So the 5307 reporters who also receive 5311 for rural areas will include a little bit of, they do a really abbreviated report to us for the 5311 part, and it has to match what they do in their other report. But otherwise, the service type data will be a part of their 5307 report that they make directly to FTA. So the 5311 is basically where we get involved in NTD reporting. As I mentioned, we're the direct recipient of the 5311 grants, and you report through us. So we will actually physically submit the report after you've submitted stuff to us. And we take care of all the follow-up activities after we submit that report and get back to you if you need to do something. There's also a tribal transit formula program. It's the same thing as 5307. They report directly to FTA, and they may also be reporting if they get 5311 from us, an abbreviated report. 5310. I'm going to mention a little bit. It doesn't really affect too many in that most people who get 5310 through us are already reporting either through 5311 or 5307. So it's just already included in what they do as one of their funding sources. The trick here is that there can be some 5310 asset only reporter. If the only thing you receive is 5310 and you operate public transportation, you're going to need to report asset only data through ODOT PTD. Right now, there are only about 9 agencies that fall into the category, and the details are confusing. So if you receive 5310 only and nothing else and have any doubts about this, please talk to your RTC, and that's a better thing done offline. So there's some reporting phases to the NTD. When you look at these bullets, it makes it look kind of easy, I guess, but it's really not that easy. All of the parts of the report actually take a good part of the year by the time everything's done and it's closed out. In fact, as I'm saying this, we still don't have our report for last year closed out. I don't anticipate any problems. A lot of this is going to be because of the multiple rounds of validation that we go through. So what happens with the initial setup is we get a letter from NTD on July 1st, like clockwork, that the next reporting season's been opened, whether or not we've closed the last year or not, like this year. And nothing's going to happen for a while on the subrecipient side. We get involved in this first, and we go through a kickoff where we need to do a bunch of stuff that just to get ready. And then we'll get you set up to enter data. It can be a little complicated sometimes because your staff may change. We have to make sure that we have the right people set up. So you'll want to pay attention to that when we get people set up to make sure we have the right people done. If you had permission before to do these kinds of things, but you haven't been active in the past 60 days, then you'll need to be activated again. Most of you probably have been, and it's not a big deal. And that's actually one of the reasons that we don't want to get you started too early, because we don't want to get you put in just to have you locked out again and have to go through that extra step. So we're going to send out during that time some information about reporting, including links to the NTD website, which you'll see later. And the policy manual really is pretty crucial. NTD updates it each year, and it'll include changes from the previous year and also clarifications. And there are also materials about how to use the online system, and you can get a lot from their website. So NTD does provide some training through webinars that they do, and when they happen, it's going to be up to NTD. My best guess is that they would probably do a webinar maybe in late August and probably another one later, but it's their discretion, so they are the ones who are going to decide. The NTD manual says that the NTD report is October 31st, but it might not be clear to someone just looking at the manual. That's the deadline for ODOT's report. That's when we have to get it in. So the subrecipients are going to have another deadline that's earlier, so we can get everything ready and make our deadline. It's usually about 2 weeks earlier than our deadline. And by that time, the subrecipients are expected to enter all their data and resolve any issues that come up based on their deadline. So it's possible for the deadlines to be extended if something happens on NTDs, and they'll usually say, okay, it's on our end, you can have more time. But we really encourage people to do their reports as soon as possible once reporting is opened up so that you have time to resolve any issues. The people who wait until the last minute are usually the ones who are going to have the most issues come up. And then they wait until the last minute, they can get pretty frantic and it's not fun for them. And when you fix one issue, sometimes it'll bring up new ones and you can feel like you're kind of going down a rabbit hole. So please start early. When people fail to meet the deadline, we're going to notify our compliance coordinators so it can be noted in your compliance file. Validation. After the original NTD's report is submitted to NTD, they review it. Most of the edits are going to involve things that are in their system, and what they say is it makes issues fire. That's the word they like to use. But some also come from a manual review when they look at things. So the issues are returned to us with a deadline to resolve them. The subrecipients have to either correct the data if they're wrong or explain why the data are correct. We submit that validation report to NTD, and that goes through another round of validation. It's the same thing as last time. If there are issues, they return to us for resolution. We get a new deadline and we have to resolve the issues and resubmit. So last year, I asked our analyst if she had any suggestions for how we could cut back on the number of rounds of validation that we go through. And she said that subrecipients should read the error message and description carefully so they can address the issue properly. It will save you time to really pay attention to these things. The validation can go on for several rounds, and with each round, the number of issues will go down, but also does the deadline for resolving them. So we're going to try to reduce the number of rounds of validation that we have. The past few years, there have been either 3 or 4 or 5 rounds of validation, actually. And with each round of validation, there's also a risk that new edits will come up that create issues if they've updated the system at all. And sometimes subrecipients who had already resolved all their issues could find out that they have new issues pop up out of the blue. So basically, the longer we're in validation, the more things that can go wrong and you have to come back to them. So after we go through however many rounds of validation it takes and the NTD staff is satisfied, they will submit the report to FTA for final approval. That can take a while. As I mentioned, our 2020 report has not been closed out yet. When they approve our report, they send a closeout letter, and this letter may mention concerns about the data, and it's possible they may not accept some of our data, or they can also mark it as questionable data, and maybe not accept them in the future if there's a problem that persists. So they've had some various concerns over the years, but so far they've always accepted our report, but they've been less happy with some things that have happened. So the top closeout issues, NTD really, really does not like getting the excuse that last year's data were wrong, but they're correct this year, especially when they continue to use that excuse year after year. And I'm sure you can all see why that wouldn't make them happy, and it really doesn't give a good impression of you or of ODOT. It doesn't instill a really good sense of confidence in our report. And if they've noted this about a recipient, the recipient will probably be watched by them a little more carefully next year. So COVID-19, the reporting goes on. What didn't COVID-19 affect? NTD reporting went on and it will continue to go on. They're probably getting some weird data and we don't know how it's going to affect the data being analyzed, probably a lot of footnotes. The urban reporters reported on a monthly basis, so there may be some way to get an idea of COVID's effects, but the rural reporters report on an annual basis. So the seasonality and all that could just kind of all be a wash. So then we're going to have the 2021 report that's going to cover a year when ridership hopefully goes up over the course of the year, but it's again going to have everything thrown in, so it may not provide a really good story about what happened. And FTA decided that the apportionments that I mentioned that go to 5307 and 5311 are going to use the data that were most favorable to recipients as subrecipients during the time when they make their decisions. So you don't have to worry about that. They're going to give you a break. So given that things can come to a halt quickly, but not get back to normal quickly. Whatever normal ends up being, things could be really interested for people who work with the NTD data. Resources. People who don't use these resources often don't do as well as people who do use them. The two biggest things are the policy manual, and you have to make sure you get the reduced run, not the full reporter manual. It has a lot of information in it. It starts out with the changes and clarifications that I mentioned before. Definitely read that part. The reduced reporter manual covers small urban reporters and rural reporters, and some of it doesn't apply to rural reporters, just unfortunate. So you kind of have to watch a bit for whether or not this actually applies to you. And the other thing is the glossary. It's a really important source of information. Drug and Alcohol Management Information System, big mouthful, DAMIS reporting. Actually, some call it DAMIS and some call it DAMIS. I guess it could depend on their mood. Either way, it's actually one of the most straightforward FTA reports we've ever had. I'm not saying that running a drug and alcohol testing program is easy or simple, but at least reporting is pretty easy in comparison to anything else we do. And the information that subrecipients receive from their third-party administrators, TPAs, matches up really well with what you're going to see on the online reporting form that you use. The background on this reporting is that in 1991, regulations were issued to help combat drug use and alcohol misuse. And of course, reporting followed. They're annual reports, and they cover testing information for a calendar year. And that calendar year is reported at the beginning of the next year. Who reports? Again, as a direct recipient, ODOT is the official reporter. We get data from 5311 subrecipients, including intercity, 5339 subrecipients, and contractors who are involved with those funds. It's another one of those things where direct recipients, such as 5307s, are going to report directly to FTA. Okay, the procedures for drug and alcohol reporting is that we're going to do preliminary work to identify who the reporters are and their contact information, and we're going to send it to our contractor, RLS and Associates. Many of you probably know them because they've worked with you on your drug and alcohol policies, they've done compliance reviews, they've been available to help you for a lot of things. And they're going to contact you mid-January. And then they're going to work with you to do the online reporting, which has to be done by mid-February. During that time, they're going to review your reports for anomalies or any questionable data and work with you if they think that maybe it needs to be resolved. If there's anything really weird, they would let our compliance coordinator know about that. I don't think that's happened very often, and all of that's done so we can submit our report on March 15th, which is the deadline for everyone across the country. So as noted, RLS is going to work with the subrecipients to resolve the issue, and then also the regional transit coordinator may take corrective action at this time if something needs to happen before the reports are done, and the compliance coordinator could get involved as well. COVID-19, well, it pretty much affects everything, and the drug and alcohol testing has been required throughout the pandemic. There have been some challenges, but it's still required. And the DAMIS reporting is also required, which will happen again next year for calendar year 2021. You'll start reporting that in January of 2022. And of course, there's stuff that you can look up online. The governing regulations are available. And hopefully you've already seen those because you've got a program going. And there is also a website that will direct you just about anything you would ever want to know about drug and alcohol testing and the reporting program. And there's a link to that as well. So miscellaneous reports. Well, that could kind of be anything. Sometimes FTA wants a special report in addition to whatever the regular reports are. And they could be one time, they could be recurring. The best example is the new COVID reporting that came up for the 5311 subrecipients, where you had to answer some questions, and then a couple months later they wanted you to answer some more questions. And thank you for your patience in dealing with that. Sometimes things are kind of put on us and we have to put them onto you. So sorry. And finally, we're done. And I just had to end with this picture because what's not to like about a cow bus? Seriously, this is from Tillamook, and thank you for sharing this picture with us.